This is Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro. Our guest this week is Cleo Folkes of Thrive to discuss how we can measure and understand social value. It's interesting how similar the planning balance exercise is to a social value exercise. Still, for reasons that we'll get into in the conversation, we're not close to turning the planning balance into a quantitative exercise. It struck me how post-occupation surveys and other ad hoc data gathering are so important to a high-quality social value exercise, and it's probably a lesson that we'd benefit to keep in mind as the next London plan and future local plans are being written. Please be sure to give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend a favorite episode or two to your network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, MS Podcast, on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. This will be our last episode of 2025. We'll be back with the penultimate episode of Season 1 on the 8th of Jan. On behalf of everyone at Centro, I'd like to wish you a joyous festive season, and we look forward to being back with you in the new year. Here is our conversation with Cleo Folkes. Cleo Folkes, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for asking me.
We always like to start a little bit with who you are and how you came to your role.
Yeah, so I'm Cleo Folkes. I'm lead consultant for real assets at Thrive, and I'm a real property person. I've been in the property sector for well over 33 years now, and I come from a research and strategy background. I have done a bit of everything in all those years, also consulting. I've done performance benchmarking. I started off working for chartered surveyors looking at central London office markets, moved on to putting together indices for what was IPD, now MSCI. Then I moved to become head of residential, where I covered everything for the UK and then became really international. Worked for private equity, worked for Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund for 9 years, and I had a really global view across asset classes, also touched upon development. It was actually never the main focus. My main focus has really been more in use. And because I've done so many different things in all those years, I really sort of see how everything fits together, what people need, what they want, what doesn't work, and also often how things aren't joined up. So it's that really broad view that's really helped me, but it's very much often driven by numbers and trying to make things tangible.
I love the description of disconnect. And normally we just use the word silos. Oh, it's so siloed. That sounds tidy, but it's actually a huge problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a well-oiled machine. And people, they also all have their own jargon. And I think the property sector is full of jargon, and all these different departments have their own little things, their own little targets and what they find important. And that jargon is really just often for insiders. We love to use acronyms, and it just makes it less accessible for others. I've also done a lot of teaching in those years, and the first thing I teach is often the jargon. And even within one business, it sometimes is that one department doesn't really understand what the other one does. And they could make so much more money if actually they were joined up and maybe thought about cross-selling to clients. It's really weird how people are just very siloed, just thinking about their own little area. But that is, I think, probably in people.
We have listeners who are planners, we have architects, we have people from various disciplines within the property sector. Could you give us a little bit of an overview what indices and indexation within the property sector entails? How does that work, and how does that relate to the work you do now with social valuation? What are indexes or indices? I don't know the correct plural.
Yeah.
You said it earlier. It's such a good plural as well. You know when you get a good plural?
It used to be indices. That's the correct word. But now people say indexes.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's really when you create an index, you need to have a data lake. Sorry, a bit of a techie, bit of a nerd. So I love my numbers. But you need to have a lot of data from a lot of different people. They all need to provide the same type of data in the same structure and to a good level of quality. So you can compare apples with apples. And once you have a lot of data from a lot of different participants, you can then calculate an average. So what is the average total return, or what is the average social value per pound of project value delivered? So once you have all this data, you can then break it down into lots of different bits that you think might contribute to that. So you can then also do attribution. But once you have lots and lots of data, you can then work out a weighted average. you can also say, okay, if we don't weight it so often, what you'll see is that, for instance, the larger projects will deliver more social value. You might see that larger projects deliver greater returns. Not always, but often it is that way. So when you do a weighted index, you get often the bigger projects having a bigger impact. But therefore, it's actually really important to compare apples with apples. So I would really do peer group benchmarking, wherein you compare the small ones with the small ones, the large ones with the large ones. You would compare offices with offices, shopping centers with shopping centers. So the types of developments that you're working on, the types of buildings that you're working on, really you should compare like with like. And of course, no two buildings are the same, but still, whether we're talking about GDVs, whether we're talking about social value, there is a way to work out, statistically speaking, what the average is, as long as you have enough participants giving their data.
What are the sort of insights that you have seen emerge from the MSCI Affordable Housing Index, for example?
What's actually really interesting is that the people that take part really get to know their own portfolio. They often think that they know it. And then when they see it back in hard cold data, they go like, oh, I didn't know, or I didn't know that one contributed that much, or I didn't know that one was like that. It makes them look differently at the data. So what they found for the social housing index was they would think more clearly about where they would give discounts to tenants. So how low would you put the rent for which tenants? Where can you be more effective? And maybe these tenants actually have a really good salary. They can afford to pay market rate. And if they pay more, then you can actually lower the rents for others where they really need it. So it made them really think strategically about where they should make money so they could afford to give a discount to tenants that really needed it. So it made them get to know their portfolio more and think strategically more so they could do more good.
So you've come from a background in valuation of, let's say, market goods to present to developers and other stakeholders to understand how to be profitable for their business. So we have data and market indicators, market data that give us signals about performance or allow you to put together these indexes, right?
Yeah.
Indices.
Well,
both. We'll accept both.
Yeah. Now you work at Thrive.
Yeah.
You deal with, let's say, non-market goods.
Yeah.
What does valuation of non-market goods entail? And how do we define social value?
Yeah. So I wanted to give the definition of social value. So I'm not giving you the Thrive one. I'm giving you one from the UK Green Building Council. And they have a social value in the built environment definition. They say it is about the creation of positive benefits for people and communities beyond purely financial returns. These benefits are derived from buildings, places, and infrastructure that support environmental, economic, and social well-being, improving the quality of life for residents, workers, and visitors. To understand their worth, these benefits are often measured and sometimes assigned a financial figure. So we'd like to add additionality, intentionality, and a long-term impact to that, which for us are very important. It's this long-term view.
That's fascinating because that actually tracks very closely with the definition of sustainable development in planning. It's the economic, social, and environmental impacts that are the three pillars of sustainability.
I was really intrigued to go and create an index and a benchmark around social value, having a way of making social value tangible and doing that in a consistent way that you can measure across asset types, across countries, and there'll be a real challenge there. So it's about how do you make social value tangible? And if you, for instance, create a job for someone who's been really long-term unemployed, there might be a care leaver, how do you put a value on that? So that's what they call valuing non-market goods. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? So who doesn't think about that when they're having their Frosties for breakfast? There is a really statistical way, and that really feeds my nerdy background. So I love that kind of thing. So you can have a statistical way of working out what the additional social value is of hiring someone who is long-term unemployed, for instance, a care leaver. So you can work out, statistically speaking, when they get a job, what is the saving that the state would make? So there's a fiscal saving, there's an economic boost. So that person doesn't need benefits anymore. They start paying taxes. They're actually happier and healthier. They won't use the NHS as much. The local economy will get a boost when they start working. But actually, often the most important is the well-being impact. And there's actually a way called the well-being calculation that will help you measure the impact on well-being. When you know that this person has got a job, you then need to actually take off the chance that person would have already likely got a job. So if 5% of them go on to find a job by themselves, you then have to take that off. And we call that a dead weight. Impact investors call it the counterfactual. So that way you only really capture the additional bit that says because you've hired someone with a greater need, then this creates extra value for society, because you could just hire anyone, right? But if that person is already working, doesn't have really great needs, it doesn't create social value. But if you hire someone, you go above and beyond, then that makes a real impact.
I remember back to my time at the LSE when I was doing my master's. I took a module on economic valuation and appraisal. And the one example that sticks with me is VSL, value of statistical life. Originally, they would take your lifetime earnings, which is a market valuation technique. How much is somebody going to earn within their lifetime?
Yeah.
And then we thought about that and said, is that basically all a human life is worth? And through that emerged kind of new valuation techniques where you started to say, actually, we're willing to pay a whole lot more to avoid someone dying. For example, we pay a premium on dangerous, hazardous jobs. There are other ways that have these kind of like revealed preferences approach to actually think about, hang on, there's a value here that's not captured purely by just what the market is willing to pay for something.
Yeah, we also actually use a lot willingness to pay. Mm-hmm. There can be a whole bunch of academic studies which are peer-reviewed and which might have thousands of people living in an area. And they actually say, I'm willing to pay £30 a month to access parks nearby. Because how do you value these non-market goods? But if you know that someone's saying, this is worth £30 a month to me, to my household, to be able to access that, it's really valuable to me. It then therefore implies the social value it has to them, because it has a value to them. So that is how we also can put values on, for instance, the availability of walking and running tracks or public play areas. There's all these various things that really work.
Alex, your point about how one might evaluate a human life got me thinking about a Wikipedia clickhole that I found myself in last week. So I just brought it up, and I was reading about the Delta Works in the Netherlands, and for the purpose of storm modeling and risk mitigation, the model values a human life at 2.2 million euros in 2008 data. So that's one option. But I think in any case, it speaks to the complexities of how you put some kind of apples to apples metric against things that have no quantification to begin with.
Yeah. And I would say it's not the only way to look at things. And always when we look at what an area needs, you always should start with the local needs analysis and what is needed there. But then if you have a few options, then how can you choose between? You could then look at what brings the most value. So that's where I think it can be really quite useful. But it is just one information point. I think it's not just useful for planning when you say this is what this design feature is what we want to put in. We think it's worth X amount. But actually then to also start measuring when you use it, is it actually working out that way? Because you can say I created so much social value because I put in a cycle rack. Well, is it actually used? So actually go back and check, measure it, and do case studies as well. And we really move towards measuring well-being and the impact. And you really need to do baselining. How were people before you started? Then while it's there, follow them over time. But actually, you need to have a control group. So you need to measure a whole bunch of other people as well to see if maybe there's something else that is changing that makes them happier. This is really a more sophisticated way that you can do things. This is where we think we'll be heading to and hope we'll be heading to. But everybody's somewhere different on their social value journey. So many people, when they're putting their planning permission, don't really do very much yet on for their planning statement. And I guess they know that what the planning department wants, it's about too often box ticking, right? So we try and move away from that, but it's too often still like that. But you can put something really interesting to them, especially if you are trying to go against planning policy. You really need to show, what can my project deliver? How can I prove there is real value to it, the real benefit that outweighs any cost, even though it goes against policy? So having a document that can really show in hard numbers, like a cost-benefit analysis, that this is why we want to do this, and this is really good, even though it might not match policy.
Going back, seeing if that children's play space is actually used, seeing if that cycle parking is actually used, raises another question about how much control we realistically even have before something's built anyway. Going back to one of my sort of soapbox points, which is that we don't make places, we make the structures that then people create places onto, right?
Yeah.
So you might have a little bit of a sort of a courtyard surface between some buildings, and you're worried about whether the waste collection can be achieved there, whether the planting is going to die in the first 5 years or not, but you can't anticipate the boxer size class that's going to use that space informally twice a month or whatever it might be. And so I sort of wonder how we can think beyond rigid metrics about, say, the square meterage of play space or the number of cycle parking spaces, and still come to a social value sort of projection when we have realistically much less control than we'd like.
Yeah, it is just that. It is just a projection. And of course, you can think about it really long and hard and be more creative, and you can put things in place. You can say, we want to put in a boxer size class, and we think that will really work there. So people are talking more about activating a space, and that brings a lot of value. But I think we need to be realistic in that developments can take a really long time before they complete, especially the really long ones. What maybe was valid when you put in a planning application might not be anymore by the time it completes. Society changes, and also maybe what is social value will change over time. So I don't think we should see things as a rigid thing. I think there are like best laid plans that might not always work out, but you have to know that it is mobile. It is a thing that changes. Yeah. And we just need to be aware of that we put in a structure to help you do better. But it's not simply, I've done that list and now all is done and it will be perfectly working out that way. It is a structure, a framework to help you get started. But you always have to adjust. At least that's my vision. I think social value is not static.
When I start to think about merging our two worlds, us as planning agents and you as a valuation, social value expert, the first place my mind goes is a cost-benefit style planning balance, right? So us as agents, right, where we put together our planning statement, our assessment of the development against the development plan, and a planning balance of how you comply with the policies, any material considerations, and the public benefits of your scheme, and on balance, whether planning permission should be granted. What if you start to attribute some quantities, some values to that balance?
Absolutely.
However,
quantify is out of a job, please, honestly.
well, I mean,
I'm begging you. No,
but just
Make
to
life
give,
simpler.
Thank you.
I mean, the idea, I think, is a good one in theory. However, I think in practice, I'm not sure about that on an individual development basis for each individual development. And Aaron, I'd love to get your thought on this, but to apply social valuation on the level of an individual planning application, to me, seems like it can be a bit problematic or impractical.
Cleo, please.
Yeah. I think you can very much put together what you think will happen at each site. Why couldn't you choose? It's all about what the local needs is. You can then work out what is needed and put in the figures for that. You can work out how many jobs you think it will create. You can work out whether you're putting in public realm or green space, and then how many people might be using that. Or you can put in an average value, but you can pick all the different metrics that are relevant. Sorry, I call them metrics. Initiatives. I'm a nerd. Okay. But you can put in all the elements that are relevant to your scheme, and whether it works out as the statistics say, no, but when you put all the different schemes together, yes, because then it will be statistically average. But the great advantage of this is that you can use this method for every scheme, whether they're small or whether they're large. There is like a local needs tool in our platform already included. You can see what is relatively more impactful. So you can apply this for small schemes and not just large schemes, because it's really the large schemes that have a lot of money for helping their case. But wouldn't it be great if you could have it for medium-sized or for smaller schemes as well? And if your scheme can stand out in that way, so I think you can make it individual for each. And we are not about following every beneficiary around with a clipboard, because that's just not doable. And even for the very large schemes, that's really hard to do. We believe that with the numbers, the statistical average, you get a really long way, and it helps you to do it really cheaply and effectively. Can we achieve 100% perfection? No, you can never achieve 100% perfection, no matter what you do. But I think it's a giant step forward, and that is really what I'm all about. And I'm not saying that we can all be perfect. I mean, we're talking about planning, aren't we? So we do our best.
We'll be right back.
We talked before about how we can quantify these things, but then the contextualization of that information is still necessary on a site-by-site basis, right? So
absolutely,
on-site play space, that's all great, but that site might be next to a beloved city park that already has good play space, and people are going to prefer to take their kids there because there's more room and there's a cafe, and they can also kind of put a blanket out and whatever.
Yeah.
And so the value of the on-site play space for that particular development is diminished.
Yes.
Because it's not going to be that attractive relative to a better offer next door.
Yeah.
I'm tempted by the quantification idea because we're taking this discretionary system head on, and we're comparing embodied carbon to housing delivery, to play space, to sense of arrival, to all of these other things. And we can put numbers against it, but then they're contextual. And then we also need to look back over time to see if we were even right, or maybe the people who end up living in that space are more inventive than we were, and you have the boxercise classes or a Tai Chi club or whatever it might be.
Yeah, but I think you should always start with a local needs analysis.
Yeah.
Because it needs to be relevant for the area. And I think the local planning authorities will be far more open to your suggestions if you've shown that you actually are doing this in response to local need. But once you have various options, so you know there is a demand for maybe a pool or a gym or a running track or whatever, and then you've got to make that choice. You can then say, actually, this is what shows it gives greater value. If there is no definite choice from the people in the area on what they want, it can just help you make those sort of better choices.
The quantification idea, and then the local needs assessment, and then the contextualization, all are meant to happen in good planning anyway. And when we quantify it, then we actually get to a coda, and we go back to the fact that it's actually so contextual as well. When we see social value entering the planning lexicon, where we're normally saying public benefit, right? Or positive weight in the planning balance. Do you think that this is us chasing something we've discussed on the podcast before, a bit of priority setting?
Yes. Well, it will help you to set those priorities. So what is most impactful? How can you be as efficient as possible and make the biggest impact? Because that is really, in the end, what you want to achieve, to make the place better, because everybody will benefit from that. And that is the real value. So social value can give you value in different ways. It can give value to local community. It can also really give value to the developer. It can give value to the investor, because if they put a project together that is really in demand and it functions well and the whole area thrives, it makes that building worth more, or whatever it is that they're building. So it's very much about trying to create the best possible outcome.
I love that. No, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. In planning, we can be quite siloed, and you have various technical consultants and their counterparts within the local authority. You know, as we mentioned before, they all have their jargon and they all deal in different currencies. The energy consultant deals in carbon, that's their currency. And the other technical consultants measure things in cost, right? Or in pounds.
Tenure mix, everything.
Tenure mix, exactly. How do we all speak the same language and deal in the same currency, right? So
yeah, but that's what we're trying to achieve. But then we only do it in social value. We haven't sorted out the rest of the world. We'll work on that one.
What would the unit be, like social value points, SVP?
I think it would be in pounds or Cleo.
Well, we do have social value pounds or euros, but we also do things like percentages. There's any kind of metric that you can create that sort of makes sense, especially in the context. And we can put a social value on carbon, but actually it's often not as high as you would expect. It is about creating a structure that works, hopefully, for everyone. But this is just regarding social value that I hope is a unifying language, a unifying structure in how you can look at things.
A very important point underlying this is the methodology that we use. If we're going to say we have an objective way to quantify and to start to deal in one currency, what's the methodology underlying that, and how have we gotten to that figure or that metric?
I think transparency is very important. There is actually a guideline from Treasury, which is called the Green Book. We actually have the author of that working for us, so we think we're pretty safe in that we know what we're doing.
Name drop.
Dr. Daniel Fujiwara.
Love it.
So there is an official way to calculate. There's a best practice method, and it's described in the Treasury Green Book, which tells you what to do and how to do it. This practice is used more widely in industry, but we all try and get the best data, and we do it to the best of our ability, and we all come out very similar, but not exactly the same. But you're going to get very similar values, but everybody has a slightly different take. So the ideal world is that we all agree on one number, but that's just not going to happen, sadly, because it would mean there would be one organization that pays for all of this to be calculated, and that everybody then pays maybe a membership fee, and it's quite expensive. So far, it hasn't really happened. But there is a really solid way of knowing how to calculate, what type of data to use, but it's most important to be transparent about your methods and to make it available to people. I think these are the most key things. We also have a few red lines. We make sure that we're more likely to underclaim rather than to overclaim. So we're very cautious on that. So the numbers actually, sometimes people don't like it. It comes out a bit low, but really the backlash is if you're a bit too generous, you overclaim. That is really not good. You need to make sure that you're very believable. So the numbers need to be incredibly robust, because also people are very much worried about greenwashing. That's why it's really quite important you use a third party who can create these kind of numbers, who have a really solid background, who are really quite believable, and that you can be sure that these numbers are more likely to underclaim than to overclaim. So for us, we have a huge governance system sitting over what we do. We use something called Impact Evaluation Standard, and there is a whole governance system sitting over that. And also how the metrics are created at every single stage. There is a very strong, in-depth governance process. Governance sounds really boring, but it's actually really important. And the transparency that's behind that is just so essential. And also you don't want to create these things in a vacuum. So you need to be working with the industry. So it's the industry people that sit on it to make sure that what you do is actually relevant for the industry. Because if you shove just an academic in a room and you come out with a figure and it turns out it's not relevant, we actually created metrics, for instance, air quality or access to daylight, where we've got figures for offices and we haven't got them yet for industrial space. But with my property hat on, I would say things like temperature control isn't really relevant for logistics space, and the value of it would be different in retail. So because of my property background, I know what you should and shouldn't do. So actually having the practitioners feeding back on that and having input in that is really important. But I would really stress governance as essential and making sure there is no greenwashing and everything is as robust as possible. Because what we're dealing with here really is you want people to trust what you're doing, because also if the planners wouldn't trust what you're doing, if people say like, where do these numbers come from? Have you just made them up? It wouldn't work. So it's really about building trust and credibility.
We have essentially a similar thing, but it's qualitative and it's the planning balance. And that's probably a good example of where people are talking about the same thing in different ways in different parts of the sector. And social value comes up as this sort of concept in planning, but it doesn't sit at the methodological base of the work that we tend to do. Who is commissioning these assessments and for what audience at the moment?
currently the biggest amount of work that we do is actually not on the planning side, it's actually on the construction side. Mm-hmm. So for many years have construction companies been told that they need to show what social value they are delivering. Mm. There is huge interest from the planning side who didn't know that these numbers existed and that there's an estimator tool, etc., because it was never really designed for that. But it does work for that. So never really realized that was already sitting there ready. Also, my background is on the in-use side, and that makes me want to stitch the whole asset life cycle together, because I think it's really important to go from the design stage, where you can look at what social value you want to design in, through to then planning, through to then the construction phase, and then actually the in-use. And actually, when you are in the planning stage, you already know what's designed in. You can then also calculate the social value that will be constructed because of the design. Mm-hmm. Then in construction, how many jobs it will create, and then actually the benefits it will have in the in-use phase. And if you can think that hopefully building will be with us for at least 25 years, you need to start thinking about the long-term legacy and who's going to look after it and work with those parties to get a more effective, really, implementation of social value. Is the one that you've worked on when you thought, if we'd thought about it at the time, how it was going to be managed, we would have done something different, or where?
It's hard to narrow it down to one example, I think, because this is so integral to our day-to-day experience as planning agents, reasoning through with the officer that the on-site space provision for communal amenity is actually not as important because you're near the park. The ability to create a publicly accessible play area is for the people in the development and for the community, and therefore constitutes a public benefit. It's really similar, going back to what we were saying earlier, these sort of social value quantifications and the planning balance, only ours is qualitative. And I think I like the idea of the quantification, but I think it'll always need to come back to what do those numbers mean in the context.
Always, absolutely, yeah. The context is hugely important, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it needs to happen at the plan making stage as well. Because, surely, I mean, there's applications for us at the planning application level, but at the plan making stage, you have policy planners who work with an evidence base and they commission reports on every aspect of planning. And then you have to do that exercise of bringing it all together. Yeah. And again, doing some priority setting, right? Absolutely. To understand which is going to deliver the most social value bang for your buck.
I think the policymaking point is excellent because I actually do have an example. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with somebody who works at a PLC developer, and they were talking to the person at the GLA who created the policy standard of 10 square meters of play space per child. And the GLA has this massive data set, and it's in the downloadable spreadsheet if you wanted to have a look, but it has all of this information about household sizes and children's ages across all of Greater London, which is a sort of index. And then it says, therefore, we can imagine for this tenure, for this size of property, for that tenure, etc., we can understand that on the aggregate, a development of that size would, on average, be expected to have X children, right? Rounded up to the nearest child, and then you multiply that by 10 square meters, and that's your children's play space expectation. And I think it's a really good sort of example of half of the data being really well justified, and then the 10 square meters was just stick a finger in the air and 10. Yeah. But put 2 3-year-olds in 10 square meters. What are they going to do? Be like, oh my God, this is so crowded, right? Also, are they all using the play space at the exact same time of day? Are they all doing it on a daily basis? Don't their parents prefer to take them down to the park, which is nicer for everyone? And you actually end up having quite generous on-site play space provisions that can be really, really well used if they're in the public realm, and other kids from the neighborhood can be there and the parents can sit there and catch up as well.
Can they become multifunction spaces?
We always argue for that. This can be adult communal amenity as well as play space. No. So this guy at the PLC was talking to the person at the GLA who set the 10 square meters. And he was saying that this is actually an onerous requirement because we don't see it being used anyway, or with any frequency up to the level of that many children ever being there at once. And he said that the person at the GLA said, it's just like a kind of a target, right? It's just like a nice to have. It's an aspirational kind of number. And then the guy at the PLC was like, no, actually in decision making, it's treated as an absolute iron rule. So if we actually did have that post-completion data where we understood whether those spaces were being used, where they are being used, why are they being used, and then others not being used, we would be able to probably come up with a much more productive policy expectation to make those spaces better used, to use the space that is not well used for something else.
Different, yeah.
And it's one of those things that would actually really help in the assessment of schemes to understand in that full context rather than, well, you have 55 square meters, but you need 60. Yeah, so that's my example.
Yeah, I think that kind of using evidence and the numbers in the end to be able to statistically prove that something does or doesn't work would be quite powerful.
Is there any component of development that has just like a real knock your socks off, terrific social value? Like a social rented flat?
Oh, it does, but it's actually surprising how much public realm adds social value because of the numbers of people that use it. There's just a huge amount of people that typically use public realm. Of course, it means that it needs to be well created, and you need to have maybe some placemaking activities there, needs to be activated. But public realm can create huge amounts of social value, and also just publicly accessible green space. And when you create green space, it can have environmental benefits, but of course, really great benefits for the health and well-being of people who can be active there. But actually, the surprising one is how much social value actually comes from public realm.
Are there any elements of a proposal that consistently produce less social value than you'd think?
From a social value point of view, carbon savings, because we only look at how it impacts the people over and above also what is normally expected to be happening already on the route towards net zero. So it's only capturing the additionality. So for social value, we are about intentionality and about additionality. So if you do things that are normal course of business, it doesn't count. It needs to go above and beyond. And because of that, actually, the amount of social value that comes from carbon savings, because it assumes you have to do a lot of that already, is actually not as great. But that's a technical issue.
It's a technical one, but it's a motive as well. You know, when we're talking about the current interest in the industry around a preference for refurbishment rather than demolition and rebuilding, it's one of those things that we actually can put metrics against. The metric happens to be carbon emissions rather than social value per se. But then regardless of what the actual outcome of that quantitative assessment is, it's still a decision that I think is being made on a more visceral level.
Yeah. We have a metric for sustainable fit out, also for circular economy methods. A lot of occupiers really want to have something that's a sustainable fit out and a sustainable building. So you can approach it that way, and there's actually a lot of value in that. So if you look at occupiers, they're often willing to pay quite a bit for a space that is sustainable. So there you can see quite a bit of value.
That's interesting that it seems that it actually has a greater value for the market than it does for the environmental savings in their own right.
We're still learning a lot.
Yeah. Such a good discussion. This is so fun.
Yeah. We went to places we didn't know we were going today, but it is a conversation.
Yeah. We always do.
Yeah.
Cleo Folkes of Thrive, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for hosting me.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.